This week, I'm going to talk about women in photography. I'm sure you've noticed that there's no crib sheet for you to print out. The names that are important that you need to know, you've already learned from previous assignments, like pictorialism and the straight photographers. Some of the big names there will turn up here. But I'm going to show you a PowerPoint and make commentary on each one. Something I've noticed is that for a lot of students, photography is something that is done by old dead white guys. And very often when I was teaching beginning black and white, I would show what I called 20 slides of a photographer who's not dead. That's when we had carousel projectors, and it was like literally slides in the page. I would load them into a projector and show them. We show that photography is a current thing done by people your age to my age. A lot of the people we're going to look at tonight are long since passed away. But I think it's important to note that it's not just a guide thing. For a lot of women, photography is kind of a guide thing. It's just technical and they don't think they can do it. And in fact, some of the greatest photographers were women. So I'm going to launch a little PowerPoint here. Share screen. And while this PowerPoint is loading up, give it a second here. Well, I've got that issue again. I can't get rid of that thing. Let's see if this works out better this time. Okay, women in photography. Bernice Abbott was something of a street photographer. These are photographers who walk the streets and find imagery all around them which speak of the community in which they live. These could be architectural details, street signs. This is Bernice Abbott herself, and that is a hunk of camera. Eve Arnold was something of a celebrity photographer. Marilyn Monroe, Jackie Kennedy and Carolyn Kennedy, Malcolm X, and that is Eve Arnold with her twin lens. Anna Atkins, this is one of the names you're going to remember from the 19th century. She was the first person to employ the cyanotype for her botany book, making photograms of ferns and leaves. And that is a picture of Anna Atkins. Ellen Auerbach. Something of a commentary and commercial photographer. Jessica Backus was a still life photographer, playing with shadows and basically anything available. And that's what she looked like. Tina Barney. Tina Barney made a lot of social commentary in her photography. Now, I want you to notice in this photograph that the privileged white crowd is doing nothing while the black house cleaners are making the bed and straightening up after the lazy, there's my 2 cents. But while the white women do nothing, the black crowd's working. And that's Tina Barney. Lillian Bassman was a fashion photographer. And Sybil Bergman was a street photographer. That's Sybil Bergman. Margaret Burke White. Margaret Burke White came out of the Clarence White School of Photography. And she decided at the age of 23 that she said at the age of 23, I'm going to be rich and I'm going to be famous. And she did a lot with her career in photography. She first set up a commercial studio in Cleveland, Ohio. And one of her first jobs was to go into a steel mill where it's really dangerous and hot and there's pouring steel and photograph it. She then later she got a chance to go onto one of the gargoyles of the Chrysler building. This is her without any safety harness or anything, photographing the New York skyline from the Chrysler building. Today, people would flip if you did that. She had a lot of license. She got licensed basically to go into the Soviet Union and photograph people in the Soviet Union. She was with the army. She was an army photographer and went in as they liberated the death camps. This is either a Dachau or Bergen-Belsen, I cannot remember which. Mahatma Gandhi. This is a picture of Margaret Burke White. This is her favorite photograph of herself. She got permission to fly on a bombing mission, and they told her the airplane is not heated, it's 40 degrees below zero. You'll need a flight suit to go on to do this if you think you're going to do this. And you can't touch anything because your fingers will freeze to it immediately. So you have to be really careful. Among her claims to fame is that she photographed the Nazi bombing of Moscow. And she asked many times if she could go on a bombing mission. She was denied over and over. Oh, you can't do that. It's too dangerous for a nice little lady like you. So she was on a ship crossing the Mediterranean to North Africa, filled with nurses. And in the middle of the night, it was struck with by a torpedo. She was thrown out of her bunk. She only had time to grab one 35mm camera before she got into a lifeboat. The boat was going down. And it was so violent that one of the nurses getting into the lifeboats was thrown against the side of the boat and broke her back. Margaret Burke White got into the boat safely. And as they were spotted by a plane, everyone was waving. She photographed the people in the plane, in the lifeboat, waiting to the rescue plane. That photograph basically went around the world and was printed in the London Times rather quickly. She became really famous. She photographed generals and the celebrities. She became a celebrity photographer. She was one of the founders of Life magazine, and her photograph was the very first cover of Life magazine. Claude Cahun, also known as Lucy Schwab, he became a she, and her photography is very dual sexual identity. And Claude Calhoun early on one of his parents remarried and a sister came in and they became lovers for life and stayed together forever. So this is also Lucy Schwab. So she picked up an androgynous name. It reads on there, I am in training, don't kiss me. And here she is as an adult, as an older woman. Julia Margaret Cameron was a 19th century pre-Raphaelite photographer. She was a personal friend to Sir John Herschel. And as a pre-Raphaelite, the theme of her photography was, this is like the precursor to pictorialism, but her photography was largely about themed around Bible stories or stories of nobility, King Arthur and the Round Table. She was nobility herself, or certainly a gentried lady. So she had servants all over the farm who modeled for her on a regular basis. I think this is her niece, Miss Duckworth. And Julia Margaret Cameron is noteworthy in that she wasn't afraid to push the camera as close as she's not the first 19th century female photographer, but she is perhaps one of the most important. She was bold about pushing the camera as close as she could to the subject matter, as opposed to backing up and showing them head to toe. She didn't care if she had chemical stains or cracked glass, about hiding the photographic process. This is one of her subjects. Another one of her photographs. Imogen Cunningham, we discussed her with straight photography, was part of the group 64. And so you already know her name from a previous lecture. And she was part of that group that embraced the sheer sharpness of photography as opposed to the softening pictorialist style. This was part of the expression that Edward West came up with, the thing as it is. So this is a very sharp photograph of steps coming down, beautifully lit. You have to pick, outside you need to pick the right time of day when the sun's just right. She photographs a lot of plants. When she was in college, she photographed for the botany department to pay for college. And she was studying chemistry, and the chemistry professor coached her through how to take a picture and how to develop film. She was contemporary. This is Frida Kahlo, Alfred Stieglitz. She was contemporary to all of these. And that is Imogen Cunningham. She lived to a ripe old age, well into her 90s, and passed away she lived in San Francisco. Pink, Panique Dijkstra. I'm not sure quite, I'm not gonna lie to you, I don't know quite know how to pronounce that. She's Dutch, and she photographs children who are adolescents. Trudy Fleischman was something of a pictorialist. There's that glass ball again. She would photograph nudes. And that's what she looked like. And that's a hunk of camera, I'd say. Martine Frank. Something of a graphic design 1960s style. This has got that Palm Springs feel to it. Street commentary. And Giselle Freud did celebrity photography. That is Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera, who I guess were lovers for a while. They were both painters. He did murals. Apparently, she was a communist. I should know his name, and I don't. And there she is. Nan Goldin. Nan Goldin initially trained out of college. She got a job on training soldiers how to survive. And she got basically tangled up in the community of people who were deep into drugs. And this is two men. One is dying of AIDS, and that's his partner. The man on the left is basically at death. And that's Nan Goldin. Jitka Hanslov is Swedish. and something of a fine art photographer. Lady Clementina Harwarden photographed her daughters, her 5 daughters, and their home had big windows, which was the only light source they had, and she would stage images of her daughters. She made excellent use of mirrors as a way of taking from one angle 2 views of the same subject matter. As you can see, the collodion print was subject to all sorts of dirt and dust in the air when it was still drying. These are her daughters on the balcony. This is probably one of her most noteworthy photographs. Florence Henry, still lives, made use of mirrors to do her still lives. So that's a self-portrait in a mirror. But mirrors are used in all her shots, are heavily represented. One of her still lives. Evelyn Hopper. Was a fashion and street photographer. This is one of her photographs of the help in a hotel. She was also a fashion photographer, as well as a street photographer. So here's the servant class, and that's Evelyn Hopper. Graciela Iturbide, I honestly don't know how to pronounce the name, photographed Mexico, primarily Mexican culture. Lottie Jacoby was a celebrity and fashion photographer. Einstein, Stieglitz, Gertrude Keisper, you know that name from the pictorialists. This is her photograph, Blessed Art Thou Among Women. The theme of her photography, besides pictorialism, was the importance of women in raising children. This is her, the sketch. Rinko Kawuchi, Japanese. I presume she did not set this fire, although she picked the right moment to take a picture of it. So she's a fine art photographer. I don't know how they did this, unless they're little toys. And that's her. Hindle Goebel is a celebrity fine art photographer. I don't know what the theme is of this image. That is Robert Mapplethorpe, a fine art photographer out of the 1970s. He died of AIDS. Interesting story around him. He and Patti Smith apparently knew each other and decided that for 1 year, they were going to totally dress up and go to some art event in New York City every single day and not miss a single evening, talk to as many people as they could. And in 1 year, they made their names synonymous with the art scene of New York City. Age. And this is the Chancellor of Germany many, many times. That's her. Jermaine Kroll. Beauty. Would photograph things that were beauty photography, as in like fashion. Dorothea Lange was part of the Farm Security Administration. She was a documentarian. This is her famous her incredibly famous photograph. She photographed all over Western United States to help make a record of the documentation of the poor of the United States. And there she is photographing from the roof of a car. Anne Miley was born in 1960, which I'm going to comment on, and grew up in Vietnam. She would photograph the war in Vietnam. And these are various American vehicles that have landed on the shores on a beach in Vietnam. That's Anne Miley. The war in Vietnam ended in 1975. That means she was a 15-year-old girl when the war ended. That makes her a child war photographer. Not the child of a war photographer, but a child war photographer herself. Helen Levitt was a street photographer. And the story behind her is she knew that Bresson would be in New York City, and she knew what hotel he was in. And when he came out, she walked right up to him and said, "Can I walk with you for the day?" And he said, "Sure." You know, she's a pretty woman. So for one day, she walked around with him and just studied how he picked and timed his photographs, where he looked, what drew his attention. And after one day, she became a street photographer herself. She photographed in New York City for years and became a noteworthy street photographer. And then, interestingly enough, at the end of her career, she decided that she understood timing and chance, and she gave it all up to be a professional gambler. Vera Lutter. Vera Lutter landed in New York City, and her apartment only saw her window from every direction was filled with buildings. So she sealed up her windows, put a tiny hole in the cover over the windows, made a pinhole out of her apartment. No, her apartment did not look at the pyramids, but made pinhole views of everything her apartment's out by, and hung print paper so they're all negatives. And then she later made a portable pinhole camera so she could take it to the airport, travel to Egypt with it. But this is the kind of thing she would have seen out of her window. And that's Vera Lutter. Vivian Mayer is now the stuff of legend. Vivian Mayer was born in 1928. She she had almost no friends that we know of. She never married, and her family was kind of like a lost question. There is a documentary called Looking for Vivian Mayer. You may want to see it sometime. It's easy to find. She was an au pair who lived in other people's homes and looked after their children. And then she would take these children for walks in the city. The parents didn't know as long as the kids came home okay. And she would take them into the dodgiest areas, and with a twin lens Rolleiflex hanging on her neck, create street photographs all over the city. Now, this is a camera that hangs waist level on her neck. She could look down and compute exposure, compute distance, compute focus, look up, make eye contact, and squeeze off a shot. As you can see, one child's looking at the camera, one child's looking up at her. She did this her whole life. This is Vivian Mayer and the camera and one of the kids, one of her charges. Then she went into a convalescent home. She put all of her stuff in a storage locker. She passed away. The bills weren't paid. So the storage locker, they use a bolt cutter and cut the padlock off and put all of her stuff up for auction. Somebody bought it and found 150,000 negatives and rolls of unprocessed film. This person started going through it, and realized this is really good stuff. Today, Vivian Mayer is believed to be one of the great street photographers of the 20th century. She lived and died in obscurity. Sally Mann, out of Virginia, is an art photographer, and she photographed her daughters, her children. She has 2 daughters and a boy. And she created a book called Immediate Family, which was a bit of a scandal because she had a lot of nudity of her children. Her kids ran around nude all the time. So she put pictures of her family as they lived in Virginia in this. And there was a bit of a scandal. Is it art or is it child pornography? She took a lot of heat for it. It is a beautiful book and a collector's item now. And that's her second daughter at the end of the doc. If you see her documentary, you'll see the making of this photograph. You'll see how this photograph was done. Helen van Meen is a Dutch photographer, and her stuff revolves around adolescent girls. I have to say, and I don't have it in this presentation, but I will look for it for a future presentation. I think some of her stuff is too closely aligned with Sally Mann. There's at least a couple of photographs which are just almost too close to be coincidence. You know, when you take a picture and if you're inspired by somebody, that's great, but be really cautious about imitating their photography because that's a slippery slope. And that's Helen van Meen. Susan Meisalas was a war photographer. She went to Central America and photographed the Salvadorian, the revolution in El Salvador. So she traveled with the rebels and photographed them. She's also a documentary photographer, street photographer. Elizabeth Lee Miller. Now this is interesting. When I was little, there was always going to be some great aunt who couldn't bring herself to say underwear. She would say unmentionables instead of underwear. Before there was Conan O'Brien, before there was Johnny Carson, there was Jack Parr of The Tonight Show. Jack Parr of The Tonight Show told a joke, a funny joke that he got basically shut down by the censors about a water closet. A water closet is the room where the toilet is. But the joke revolves around WC. Very funny story. Anyway, Lee Miller had been sexually abused in her childhood. She escaped her home, went to New York City, and one day she was walking across the street when a car missed her by an inch. And she just absolutely fainted and collapsed. And the guy driving the car stopped, scooped her up, got her into his car, took her to his work, took her to his office, gave her a glass of water, and realized how beautiful she is and how he had almost killed her. He was Condé Nast, owner of Vanity Fair and Vogue magazine. And the fashion career of Lee Miller was totally launched. Lee Miller was the it girl of the 1920s in fashion. She was incredibly beautiful until this ad came along, photographed by Edward Steichen. This is an ad for Kotex in 1928, and it became a scandal. And it ruined her career immediately, that you would actually talk about it. This print ad was in magazines where any child could look at it. It destroyed her career. Steichen wrote her a letter of introduction and gave her the money to cross the Atlantic to France, where she wanted to meet Man Ray, the surrealist photographer, and learn photography. She went to Paris, discovered he was actually vacationing in the south of France, went to the south of France, basically ambushed him and said, "I'm your new student." And she was the one who accidentally turned on the lights when he was making and developing a print, and invented the solarized photograph, which Man Ray tried to call a rayogram. Apparently, the story goes, a rat ran across her foot, and She startled her. She threw her arms in the air, hit the lights, turned it off immediately, apologized. But this new technique was developed. That is Lee Miller. Lee Miller went on to join the army and become an army photographer with and go into Germany following the collapse of the Nazis. She photographed into the death camps. Like Margaret Burke White, but a different death camp. And later, she was so filthy, after the Nazis had fallen, she took a bath in Hitler's bathtub. Lisette Modell, Italian, went with her sister to take classes in photography and pursued it, and she became something of a street photographer, really flamboyant images, really great stuff on the street. Wasn't drawn to the most beautiful people, but captured fascinating moments with her camera, including this apparently destitute man. Like I said, it wasn't about beauty, but very often people who are just happy. Sarah Moon, that's I guess her real name, Marielle Hadengu. Sarah Moon was a fashion photographer in the 70s. And when I was in school, we all wondered how she took her pictures. You know, did she wildly overdevelop? What did she do? How did she make her pictures? Did she cross-process? Did she shoot Ektachrome and develop it as a C41 film? Did she shoot a C41 film and develop it as Ektachrome? How did she get her look? But her photographs had a distinct look to it that was, and she kept the secret. She was also, strangely enough, photographed children's books. I bought one of her children's books, Little Red Riding Hood, for my daughters when they were young. And I started reading the book and I realized this is maybe not the book I want to read to my kid, because it has an alarming ending. Little Red Riding Hood comes to a bad end. But Sarah Moon does, her photography has a terrific look. Sarah Moon. Cindy Sherman. She wouldn't tell you she's a photographer. She would tell you she's an artist. And she created a series called Film Stills that looked like they were just like one frame taken out of a movie. She is in all her own photographs. So that is Cindy Sherman right there. And it invites the question, does life imitate art or does art imitate life? When I was 19, I was in a car accident. There was blood everywhere. And all I could say later was, it was just like being in a movie. Does art imitate life or does life imitate art? So she would stage these situations that look like they're out of a film with herself in it. Every one of these is Cindy Sherman herself. And that's Cindy Sherman. Stop sharing. Now, the names you need to know from there, you already know from other lectures. Gertrude Keisber, Margaret Burke White. Previous lectures. So this was really for your enrichment and for your edification. And I need to emphasize these were great photographers. Women are all great photographers. It is not just a guy thing. A lot of women are intimidated by the camera, think, oh, guys understand that kind of stuff. I can't do that. Of course you can. Of course you can. They did it, you can too. So thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed this. Until next time.